So for tonight, it was kind of weird in terms of the preparation for the message. Half of it came from a conversation with a friend, another came from reading something with Heather, and then there was just a lot more. Watching that video, the human test, before, there's a reason for that, of course. Last week, we talked about solitude and meditation, and one of the things that was expressed was this simple point. God doesn't expect you to be anything other than human. And one of the things about that is that, we're one of the few creatures on this earth, I'd say one of the only creatures on this earth, that is so out of touch with our own nature that we don't live in it, and we oftentimes reject it. And there's a lot of argument in the Christian community about the sinful nature and that aspect of it. A lot people fight about original sin and whether or not, and contending with our nature and so on. But one of the problems with that perspective is that even though Paul talks about how we're born into sin, that doesn't express the point that we are born carrying that so much. Children, they don't have a conscience of what they're doing. A lot of kids have to learn when they're doing something wrong. Even when Christ came and ministered, he oftentimes mentioned the point that it's the Spirit that comes to convict. If I did not come and tell them, then they would not know their deeds were evil.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with this is that, for God, he also carries that perspective of seeing us as children. It's oftentimes something that we kind of miscalculate, because when we talk about being born again, we presume, like, we're usually adults when we're born again. I know that there are lots of little kids who get saved and so on. They say the prayers, they maybe get baptized, but a lot of kids don't have the capacity to really make that decision. And that's not to say that they're, like, incapable of understanding. It's simply to say that there's a lot of pieces missing. Like, when you sit there and tell somebody that Jesus died for their sins, even a lot of adults can't really wrap their head around that. They hear it, they hear you say it, they understand the concept, but it doesn't have the weight of understanding what a sacrifice it really was. What a sacrifice it really is. So it falls flat. Like, I've had so many people in the past sit there and be like, oh, okay, yeah, Jesus died for me. Cool beans. The thing about it is that we don't understand a lot of that because we often fail to be able to put something to it. Kids don't have a lot of experience in life. They don't know what it is to have somebody else sacrifice themselves for them. Not usually. There are special circumstances. But as adults, most of us have come to times where we have experienced things that can be a rough analog for what we're having happen. Even when Jesus came teaching about the kingdom of God, he used parables. Well, it's because in order to describe this weird thing that we're not accustomed to, he had to bring it down to a level that we could consciously understand. If even last week when we talked about, like, transactional relationships and the way that a lot of Americans and even people in Western civilization in general, or Western society, I should say, they have a certain bent towards transactional relationships. If you do good things, you earn this much love. And you have to earn the love and appreciation of other people. You have to earn the respect and admiration of the people around you. That's how it works. That's how we understand it. That's how we live. We apply that to God all the time.
Oh.
Yep. That's why so many of us live a life that's devoted to following laws. Like, you understand that, like, when you actually read the Gospels, when you actually read even what Jesus specifically talks about, the life that God ordains for us is not the lives that most of us are living. Most of us are living lives of do's and don'ts. We have our lists. We look at the Ten Commandments. We look at the Beatitudes. We look at the writings of Paul. We look at the writings of Moses in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Leviticus. And we draw from those the do's and don'ts. But when you look beyond those things, when you look at the actual exemplifications of the people that God loved and walked with, you read the stories in Kings. You read about David. You read about Solomon. You read about, even in the Judges, you read about Deborah and Samson and Gideon. You see the interaction that God has with his people. He's calling David a man after his own heart when David's committing so many different things that are sinful. But that doesn't change God's opinion of him. Later on, you have Jesus talking about, like, John the Baptist, for example. John the Baptist had been the person who was chosen by God to be the one to baptize Jesus. When the two babies were in the womb, they were leaping in the womb when they were near each other. There is so much evidence there where John himself would have been able to say, yeah, this is the guy, this is the Messiah. In fact, he did that openly. And then, right before his death, when he was in prison, he got low and he sent a few of his followers to ask Jesus, are you really the Messiah? In that moment, he faltered. And yet, Jesus goes on to express that in his own words, there are none more blessed than John the Baptist, born amongst men. See, the thing about it is as I said last week, God has no illusions about us. Mm-hmm. We do. We have tons. We're a mess of delusions and false identities that we craft and formulate and gravitate to. Sometimes they're pushed onto us. You know, if people like treat you like you're supposed to be a hero for them, you'll start believing you're supposed to be a hero for them. But if you don't know what that looks like, if there's no humanity in that, you start gravitating towards images of what that looks like. And suddenly you start taking on this kind of idealistic interpretation of what that looks like. Suddenly you're looking at, like, well, nobody likes Superman, but Batman, for example. Or Iron Man. Or maybe Captain America sometimes. The point is that you start looking at these kinds of illustrations of heroes. Or, you know, maybe if you're more that type, maybe it's like Soren Kierkegaard or Billy Graham, if you want to be more biblical about it. But you draw these interpretations from idealized versions of these people, and you start to build that into yourself, and you kind of craft this identity based off of an idea of what somebody's supposed to be like, and then you start trying to manifest that. And the problem with all that is that there's a lot of made up stuff there. I mean, even these heroes all those heroes are fictional characters. They're fictional magical beings who have some form of, like, superpowers that we don't have. I can't hold a helicopter in place with just my arms. I can't do that. I don't have billions and billions and billions of dollars to buy robotic things and pay people to make me fantastic contraptions so that I can be a hero. Anyway, the point is that we, as in this kind of realm, in the sphere of things, we're crafting false versions of self, and then we're trying to live up to them. And of course you can't live up to that. You know, it doesn't matter which hero you gravitate towards. It doesn't matter what you gravitate towards. If it's an idealized version, you're never going to line up.
Wow.
It can't happen. Because your idealized versions, even if you get a taste of it, if you can put your fingertips on it, it will still, you'll only ever be able to get that close. And the bad thing about it is if you do get that little taste, you'll tell yourself, oh,
It's possible.
it's possible. It's like with gambling.
If I try hard.
With gambling, you get that little rush of endorphins from getting lucky once.
Yeah.
And then you say, oh, well, I can do that again. And then you fall into that trap. And then you fail and fail and fail and fail. And then you get that little bit of taste again. And then you fail and fail and fail and fail.
Addicted, yeah.
In a lot of ways, the manifested personalities that we maintain are the same way. And see, the thing about it is, and this is the really dangerous part, this is why this is something that we're talking about tonight, because it stands between us and God all the time, even the really good ones. Even if the person that you are trying to be is an idealized version of Jesus Christ, you will still fail and you will still fall into this trap, because that identity is something that is firmly and entirely in your control. And that's what's dangerous about it. Because see, the whole frustrating thing about us as humans, about human nature in general, is that we don't have all the control that we want. We wish to be able to maintain the behaviors that we feel are appropriate. We wish to constantly be able to control ourselves and the world around us in such a way so that we can be our version of perfect, or our interpretation of perfect. Especially when we enter in something like the Godhead, where we're looking at Jesus and we're looking at God, and God is calling us into perfection, as it were, and we're saying, oh, well, I have to do this now. And the problem with that statement is right there in the I have to do this now. That's the bad part. See, in all instances throughout the Bible, Jesus says, follow me. When he walks up to each of the people who became the disciples and then became the apostles, he didn't say, go do good. He said, follow me. When he walked up to the rich young ruler and the Pharisees who came up to him and said, oh, I want to be with you. And he gave them warnings. But he also said, follow me. The one man said, wait, let me go bury my dead dad, or whatever it was. No, let the dead bury themselves. Come with me. I want to come follow you. What do I do? Give away all your worldly possessions and come. But I don't want to give away all my worldly possessions. I'm rich. That sucks. It's a choice.
Is that what he said?
No. It's a choice, though. The thing is that consistently, Jesus' words were to follow him, and that's all that we do. Okay? And the problem that we run into is that even with the concept of Jesus, we construct this interpretation of him where he's God in human flesh, and that is true, but not in the way that we make it. We treat Jesus like a Superman. you know. And then what's worse is then we also take him and model him after ourselves.
Oof.
See, one of the most egregious problems is that we take our idealized version of Jesus and we wrap it in our own ideals. And see, again, this is the problem with that whole thing, where we are the ones who are constructing this narrative of what this person is meant to look like, what we are meant to look like. So that's why you get images of Jesus like... This is why you get images of Jesus wrapped in a Confederate flag holding an AR-15. These are things that people do. And it's because we're holding a velociraptor. Anyway, the thing is that we take him and we try to mold him in our own image, and it's not always conscious. See, one of the things that we also run into here is that while we're trying to kind of solve this whole identity thing, and we're missing the point because we're trying to control it, we also succumb to our own nature and our own issue of just being ignorant. And that's not stupid, it's just not knowing everything. I mean, again, we go back to Jesus talking in parables because he's trying to describe the kingdom of God to us, and we don't get it. When he comes and describes marriage, for example, and he says, when he talked about how Moses gave us the right to have give our spouse a certificate of divorce, and he goes on to explain that, well, in truth, in reality, it's not God's will that anybody get divorced, but we gave you that ability because your hearts were hard. He's had to make allocations for us as a result of our inability to comprehend him. And he understands that he's not exactly comprehensible. I mean, if you want to get into the realities of trying to understand a timeless being who exists in a dimension outside of anything that we can even perceive, well, it's a fun topic of conversation, but it gets very weird after a while. And then you get into trying to understand his perspective looking at us. And that gets even weirder, because he's seeing things about us that we don't even see. All your emotions, all your psychology, all of your ego, your id, all those different parts of who you are, they're all there for him to see. He can see the way that your heart beats irregularly. He can see the fractured bone that's gradually causing you more and more problems, and you don't even know about it. You just think it's a little uncomfortable, and you blame it on age or something like that. He can see the things that are going on inside of you. Mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, everything is available to God.
And it's not even all available to us.
Right.
Like, we don't even know all of what we're thinking or feeling.
Yeah. We have plenty of occasions where we just don't get it.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's the thing that we have to kind of come to terms with, is that's okay. It's okay to not always be in control. In fact, it's perfect that you're not always in control. If you always had control, you don't need God. And the thing about it is that through the power of God, you see all kinds of crazy things happen. You see people tell the weather to stop and things like that, and it stops. You see people walking on water, breaking very laws of physics because of the power of God. But that's when we're with him. Outside of him, we're these little flesh creatures that struggle with so many different things. I mean, we have a hard time picking up the phone because it's uncomfortable to answer the phone. This is where our species is. The what?
That was directed at me. I know it.
I'm just sharing what I'm getting. I don't know. It's
You
directed at
sound like
anybody.
my dad.
The thing is that, like, we're meant to exist in more, but also, at the same time, we also have to be able to accept where we're at. Our very nature is a thing, and not all of it is sinful. There's plenty that's neutral. There's plenty of it that's good. God made us in His image. Which means not everything about us is evil. Yes, sin went out and corrupted the world. Yes, we brought that on when we chose to disobey Him. Yes, these are all facts. But it doesn't mean that it tainted every single thing, and it certainly doesn't mean that, for those of us who are redeemed, that we still carry all of that. When you're freed from your sins, you're freed from your sins. Whether or not you walk in that, that's a whole other subject. But when we're free from the sinful nature, we're adopting the cloak that Jesus would put over us in order to live and survive and function in a new way. And what's more is that we're called to live that way. We're called to be in that life. Not one of conquering for Him, but one of conquering with Him. When God created the heavens and earth, He created the Garden of Eden, and He placed us in it. The intent being that we were to be co-laborers with Him, caretakers of this world and everything in it. And that's what Adam and Eve lived as. They lived in the Garden of Eden for an untold amount of time, because there was no death at that point. And for some unknown amount of time, they lived and they took care of the garden, and they slept and they ate and they walked with God. And that was what He made us to be. And do you understand that, like, the entire gospel, this whole book is a story about Him trying to bring us back into that relationship. The Holy Spirit comes and lives with you, right? We understand that. That's John 16. Jesus gives explicit information about this. And He describes the way that the Counselor will come and be a part of us. His Spirit, the same Spirit that was in Jesus, comes to us and lives with us and becomes a part of us. And with that, and through that Spirit, we are unified with God, and that's something that He talks about in John 17 when He prays for us. Prays for us to understand the unity that we have through Him and His Father as they have with each other. This is what we're called into. This is what He yearns for, because it puts us back into that place of walking with Him every day. Because we're now carrying His Spirit. If He's a part of you, then He's with you. But this is a hard thing for us to understand, and especially with the temptations of this world and the very many things that we exist with. And then we come into the conditioning, which brings us back to what we're talking about with trying to control our own identities. We don't know God, but we do know these things that we see. We do know these things that we're told. Consider for just a moment that so many of us have grown up in such a way where we're not close to God. Even though we may have been raised in church, we've never been allowed to know God. We know about Him, but we don't know Him. And then we have all these people who kind of exist in this place where we're trying to follow these laws and do good in order to be found worthy of heaven. Well, once you start to do those good things, then you start to feel pretty good about yourself, like you are worthy. But this can also come with, because it's coming out of a place of achievement, it can also come with elements of pride. You can't help it. I've experienced this. I think everybody has to some extent, whether they want to admit it or not. But they've had days where they look at themselves and say, wow, I didn't actually sin today. Some people will like immediately try to quash that and say, no, I must have sinned somehow. But you can't find it. And then you start to feel proud. You did good. You did it. Now God's happy with you, you think. I mean, he must be. You followed the commandments. You did everything that you were supposed to do. But the thing about it is that, I mean, one, the oft-quoted Isaiah 1 in this group illustrates that doing what you're supposed to do isn't always good enough when it's missing the intent. In Isaiah 1, God gets after the Israelites through the prophet Isaiah, speaking about their sacrifices and their traditions and their festivals dedicated to him that are in name only, because they've stopped. It's not in their hearts anymore. So he has Isaiah telling them, learn what mercy is. Learn compassion. Take care of your widows and orphans. Because in the end, it's not the same thing to do good things, knowing that you're doing good things to do good things, versus doing good things because it's a part of you. And this is what we're called to be aligned with. But we struggle with that distinction. We struggle with that distinction because, when you're conditioned to do transactional things, to earn all the approval in the world, to earn your place, or to prove that you are who people believe you are, then yeah, you're gonna falter. And yeah, it's gonna be really hard on you. Because you're adhering to things that aren't necessarily real. And they're not necessarily things that God called you to. In 1 John 4, when John talks about perfect love casting out fear, he talks about the perfection of love coming from the place of being with God. We'll go ahead and glance at it real quick, just so I don't butcher any of the wording or anything. Because
What'd you say it was?
1 John 4. God is love. Starting in
7?
verse 16, roughly.
Oh.
God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. We can go on to talk about those who claim to be loved, but I want to stop right here. We love because he first loved us. One of the grandest truths that you will find again and again and again throughout people. We can talk about evangelical Christians, we can talk about conservative Christians, we can talk about progressive Christians, we can talk about Christians as a whole. We can talk about people in general, period. We can talk about any kind of subgroup of human that you find yourself dealing with on a routine basis, especially in our culture. People, more often than not, are searching and striving and fighting to find love. To find whether that looks like acceptance, whether that looks like admiration, whether it looks like respect. All of these things come under the umbrella of love. Because we all need that. That's not a may ability. That's a must. As a result, we find ourselves, all of those transactional things that we're doing all the time, we're trying to get there. We're trying to get that love. We're trying to find it. We're trying to acquire it, to prove that we're worthy. That's something that all of us are doing on some level. And to use like the evangelical Christians as an example, because I was talking to a friend earlier and this came up, to kind of illustrate the point of except trying to gain love. And nobody does this consciously, of course. It's usually subconscious. But when you see these people who are wrapping Jesus in a Confederate flag with an AR-15 and saying, "That's my Lord," we create this idol. But in reality, it's easy to judge people. But when you look at people compassionately, even these people who are so clearly wrong about Jesus' character, because, he used a whip, after all, not a gun. So abiblical. But when you pull it all apart and look at it for what's really going on underneath the surface, it's easy to get caught up in the stuff at face value. Yes, that's an idol. Yes, that's blasphemous. Yes, they're wrong. Yes, their interpretations are horrifying. But they don't know him. Most of us don't. Most of us have barely reached the surface or touched the surface of God. We know about him, we read the stories, but we don't know him. So what a lot of these people are doing, and this is true of all of the different types of Christians that I just listed off and so on, what a lot of people are doing is they're gravitating towards people who they can know. A lot of you take your teenagers in your youth group and they say, "Well, I want to be holy. I know I'm supposed to be holy. I know that's what I'm told to do, but I don't know God." Well, my youth pastor, he's teaching about God. He must know God. So I'll go get close to him. And that's what they do. They gravitate around that person and they put them on a pedestal. And the irony of it is the youth pastor's up there like, I don't really know God either. But if I draw close to the pastor, he's preaching, he's telling everyone about God, he seems to know his stuff. If I draw close to him, that must be the closest thing that I can get to God, right? So the youth pastor's over here reaching out to the pastor, trying to earn the love of the pastor. The pastor's reaching out to, whichever one people in his life that he admires and believes are righteous, and they're doing the same thing. And you have this interconnected web of people who are reaching for love, reaching for admiration, reaching for a deeper understanding of God, and not getting there because they're busy following other people. So, what we end up doing is we end up following one another and not really drawing close to God at all. We just kind of create our own interpretations based off of the different people's views and what works to get their love. And we end up with idols. We end up with more false identities. We end up with, but they come with the affirmation of our peers. And in the end, that's the love is what we're craving, right? So that little box is being checked, and we're feeling fulfilled in ways. And then we draw no closer to God. But we feel like we're doing good. So we're justified to live that way and act that way.
Or we think it's the closest we can go.
Right. And this is where a lot of people live. And when we look at them honestly and see them for who they are, that's what's going on underneath the surface. It's easy to judge, it's easy to get caught up in everything, but when God's looking at us, this is the kind of stuff that he's seeing. He's seeing what's underneath the surface. It's why he can be so merciful. It's why he can be so forgiving, so patient. He doesn't see that little kid breaking things in the house because, purely as the kid breaking things, he sees the kid crying out for attention because they feel abandoned. They need love. They need somebody to walk up and give them a hug. This is what he's seeing. And this is what he's seeing 1 billion times over. With every one of us carrying the various wounds that we have, carrying the various false identities, the various notions of delusion and falsehood, all these different things that we're carrying around, he's seeing them. And he's knowing that we all have this. He's seeing the conservative Christians fighting with the progressive Christians. And he's seeing that they're both in the camps they're in because they wanted acceptance. And they found it in these particular territories. And now they're fighting with each other because they're not his territories. But they have his name on them. And of course they're fighting because he's not part of this conversation or this fight, not really. He's only there in word. They pull scriptures out and they throw them at each other as weapons, and it just becomes a thing where it's just like, what's God's actual heart here? Who is actually carrying God's heart? Well, neither can answer that question honestly because they're trying to. But they're both coming from that same place of an idealized version of who God is. And see, the funny thing about all of this is that while we could sit here and say, shame on all of you, that's not the point. The point is that in the midst of all of this, it's okay. If there is one thing that I feel is implicit for all of us to take away from this message, it's this. It's okay to not have it all right. It's okay to not know. It's okay to need others, to need God. It's okay to not have everything together. It's more than okay to not have everything, all your ducks perfectly aligned in a row. It's okay to be messy. It's so very okay. Because no matter how hard you work to make it look like you're not, God sees through it. You can order your life. You can have your perfectly sanitized environment with your bonsai tree that you've kept perfectly for years. And your perfectly groomed dog and white picket fence and all these things. And God's just sitting there like, yeah, that's great. Your world very much looks in order. But I'm seeing the chaos in your soul, where you're clawing at yourself and screaming to get out. we've talked a number of times about how behavioral modification is not the same thing as being changed by the Holy Spirit. And the thing about it is that, again, it's okay to not have that perfectly down. It's okay to not have it all together. It's okay that you struggle between your conditioning and the Word of God. God will sort you out. Where you rely on Him, where you lean on Him, He will do that. You know, we need to understand first and foremost, like, one, that we are loved for who we are, just as we are. And that involves being, I feel like I've said this enough times, but I'll express it again. That involves being completely known and understood on the very deepest levels of who we are. That's why I point out all the stuff about, like, God seeing our emotions and being able to see through everything. Because He knows you on the most intimate levels. And He loves you. He knows the darkest thoughts that you have. And He loves you. He knows the darkest parts of your nature. He sees that seething violence way under the surface that you keep buried because you're so afraid of it getting out and hurting the people that you love. And He loves you. He's not ashamed of you. You might be ashamed of you, but He's not. He loves you. And this is where we need to start. Right there. The other part that we need to understand is that He understands us entirely. This is something that we struggle with all the time. The reason why I brought up the whole thing about Jesus's character and the issues of us trying to, like, comprehend the whole, He's God but He's not type of thing, is that God does entirely understand our struggle and our state of mind and all the different things that come with this. I'm going to read a couple verses to kind of, like, underline that, because it is, I'm not saying anything that's not biblical here. The first part is out of Hebrews 2 specifically. Okay, I guess we're just going to read chapter 2. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away, for since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard Him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to His will. It is not to angels that He has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking, but there is a place where someone has testified. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor, and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to them. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God He might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, shall take the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what He suffered, or should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here I am, and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. In this chapter, I mean, it's literally just breaking down the fact that Jesus was fully one of us and fully understood the temptations, the sufferings, the things that we go through, the things that we think are not human. He experienced all of it. That little human test, and I'll post a link to that video in the description of this, just so people can go listen to it themselves, just to understand it. That video highlights all of these little aspects of being person, the things that we're kind of ashamed of, the things that are kind of adorable about us, the things that are really deep and meaningful about us. And it's all just this little spattering that Zay Frank lays out to kind of help us see that, look, we're all like this. We all do some of these things. Maybe not all of us have eaten boogers as adults. But a lot of us have, weirdly. A lot of us have realized that we're really jerks to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us have definitely experienced waking up and knowing that somebody's not part of our lives anymore. There are all kinds of things that we are sharing, and we don't always appreciate that Jesus shares in them too. I just had to quote the line to a friend of mine when she was talking about stepping into leadership and potentially stepping into leadership at her church, how she was asked to, but how the entire church has known her since she was a little girl. And she was very hesitant about that. And I had to quote this line from Jesus, of course. It is only amongst his family and friends that a prophet is without honor. And this was what he said after going back to Bethlehem, preaching the gospel and having them just be like,
Listen.
Who does Jesus think he is? I know.
I used to change his diapers.
I used to change his diapers. I remember that one time he accidentally burnt down my fence. I don't know if that really happened. The point is, it's the same. Familiarity can breed problems like that. And Jesus got to experience that just as much as we experience it. As my friend pointed out, she felt like she would go up and preach messages now, and she never got any feedback, and she didn't know if the response was, oh, good for her, she's so cute doing little pastory things, or if it was, okay, whatever, just her being her, carry on. But the irony of it is that, like, reading this very powerful little chapter from Hebrews where it just outlines the realities of, like, what it was that Jesus came to represent and the way that he came to represent us and be a sacrifice for us, and the way that God sees us, and the way that Jesus is able to look at all of us in our broken states and say, "You're my brothers and sisters," and mean it, and not be ashamed about it. The irony in all of this is, like, our response to Jesus, which is something that he outlines in Matthew 11, which is one of the other verses I had to look up. In talking about John the Baptist, he makes this point in Matthew 11:18. He says, "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is proved right by her deeds." Just to kind of underline this whole thing, that there's nothing new about this, where we are, like, looking at ourselves and judging ourselves so grotesquely. The Pharisees and the people at the time, they literally had these two very, very different religious personalities, and they judged both of them for doing the opposite things. John's out there fasting and going without water in the desert, wearing camel furs, and they're like, "These demon possessed." And then Jesus comes and he's, like, hanging out, eating and drinking with people, and they're like, what a glutton. Oh my gosh. I bet he doesn't even fast. Get on my righteous level, scrub. Got totally, like, I wish I knew more Greek.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
I'm not the only one.
Yeah. But yeah, like, they were no better at embracing their own humanity at that point in time than we are now, and Jesus was fine with it. I mean, you do understand that, like, one of the key elements of the gospel is actually just living a good life. Like, while we're over here obsessing over doing right and wrong, one of the key messages in the entire Bible is this: live your life as though you are living for God. Be fruitful. Like, live a good life. It's good to laugh. It's good to be in community. It's good to be with other people. It's good to need other people. It's good to need God. Gal, it's really good to need God. Like, without him, it's weird. Like, there are so many things that are really good for us. It's good to be happy. One of the most important things to have as a follower of Jesus is joy. You ever been to churches that have no joy? I mean, you may as well be walking in, like, there may as well be a draft in there. It feels so cold and empty. It just feels dead. It's an experience that I think we've all had to some extent. I mean, especially the three of us sitting here, because we're all grown up in church to some extent. But, I mean, I know I've been to a lot of churches, and I could always tell the ones that were like that. You just walk in there and you feel it. It's just
Somber.
very somber, very dead, very cold, very... Sometimes it even is, like, literally physically cold. And it's just weird. But this is the thing that we end up having to kind of, like, come to terms with, is that You know that, like, the entire concept, like the whole following of legal leanings, like that's actually a throwback to Roman philosophy. Like, Roman and Greek philosophy was very moralistic, very dualistic, very stuck on doing good and doing wrong, and always choosing to do right. You determined your value, because Rome especially was a meritocracy in a lot of ways, which means that you gained value in society by doing good things, by being a good person. You know, especially when
Like China.
especially when Stoicism became like a major aspect of Roman society. So we have these things where we've actually, and unfortunately, like when Rome adopted Christianity, they adopted Roman ethics into Christianity. That's why we have this weird overlay. It's why you see Jesus over there, like, having dinner with prostitutes and tax collectors, and you see us in church nowadays scoffing when somebody that's clearly a prostitute walks into the building and saying, do we even allow people like that in church? Because we missed the point. We're so stuck on, like, the good and bad, like the right and wrong,
Have
that
to be good to be here.
right, that we can't even see the human. We can't even see the need for each other, to be accepting each other, to be able to, like, look at one another and say, yeah, you're a person too. And you know what? I'm loved by God, which means you're also loved by God. And we have that in common. I'm sure that we have a lot of other things in common too. Do our political beliefs agree? No. Do our booger eating habits agree?
Maybe.
Maybe. In a safe space we can talk about that, but not right here in the middle of the church service. I can't tell you how many times I've looked over and seen people picking their nose in their cars. I'm just saying, like, it's such a common thing. And
I'm going to be looking for that now.
do it. It's actually a little jarring. The worst one, though, I always remember, was watching this guy, older dude. He had to be about 50. Literally, we're sitting at the stoplight, and I watch him just sitting there, just.
Nuh-uh.
Not joking. Not even, like, remotely playing around. I'm just staring there in, like, horror. Like,
Okay,
I'm just, like, looking over.
Got
I'm like,
my gag reflex a little bit. Oh.
well, now there's a game to be played.
No, there's no game. There's a message to finish.
Fine. You know, the thing about it is that, like, despite everything, like, we have all these different aspects to consider. We have nature, we have nurture, we have these kinds of false identities, and those false identities need to be torn down, just plainly and simply. You know, we need to stop putting ourselves on pedestals that aren't realistic. We need to stop, like, looking to imagined versions of heroes as an ethos to live by. Like, I remember one of my teachers back in my comedy tragedy teacher back in high school, and she talked about how she was such a big Lord of the Rings fan, and she thought Aragorn was the hotness. And she came to school one day, and she was like, I don't even remember why she brought it up, but she was just like, I read this article, an interview with Viggo Mortensen, you know, the guy that plays Aragorn, you know? And she's like, and he's weird. He's really weird. And now I don't know, because I feel like I'm starting to think that maybe what I'm actually in love with is this idealized version of a character, this imaginary person in this book, and not actually the guy that portrayed him.
You think?
And I'm just sitting there, I'm like, well, yeah, he's, like, perfect. the thing is that, like, we have to kind of start, like, backing away from, like, the imagined heroic people sometimes, because especially with time, even historical figures develop a legend to them that's not realistic. And we need to start focusing more on their humanity and our humanity and embracing that. Because that's okay. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to have weird little quirks. I think the reality is that most of us, like, we're so used to keeping all that stuff down and being ashamed of ourselves that we get ashamed of things that aren't worth being ashamed of. Like, is it really a reason to be ashamed and to not talk about it? The fact that we all have felt the loss of somebody at some point? Like, nobody talks about it. We don't just present that in conversation. Obviously, like, it would be kind of a weird conversation starter unless you're, like, at a wake or at, you know, at a couples therapy group or something like that. But the thing of it is that, like, we're so self-involved and so focused, so inward. And, you know, we don't want to go there. We don't want to emote. And going back to the solitude message, there's so much stuff that we have just as a result that we've just, like, pulled in and that we're holding here. And we're not addressing it and we're avoiding it. And what's more is the irony of it is that it actually makes us more isolated from people because a lot of people are having the same experiences. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's sharing. Nobody's discussing it, which means nobody's processing it. And as a result, we're all feeling so alien from one another. Because suddenly we, like, even the little quirky things, you know, even the little quirky things, where it's just like, have you ever got a text from somebody and found yourself smiling like an idiot at the text? There's nothing wrong with that, but we don't talk about that. Because we judge ourselves for smiling like an idiot while staring at the phone. It's funny when it's brought up because we're all just like, yeah, I've done that, that's funny. But you know, outside of that, we're just like, I would never do that, that's weird. There's just so much about us where it's like, it's okay to just be human. Especially, like, when we're redeemed, there's a lot that's okay. There's a lot of weird stuff that we hold as sin, and it's not. I mean, even, like, there are even people who feel like it's, if you have a dirty house, that's sinful. There are people who literally preach the gospel of cleanliness is next to godliness. And that's nowhere in the Bible. That's not real. But people live that way. So understanding, like, you know, we have to come to terms with our messiness, our humanness, and accept that and be okay. And remember these things, you know. Number one, you are loved. Live in that love. Number two, God understands you. It's not just that he knows you, he understands you in the most intimate levels. And lastly, it's okay to be human. It's okay to be fallible. It's okay to not have it all down. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to be hurt and broken. It's fine. That's why God wants to be close to you, so he'll help you put all those pieces back together. The one verse that I'm going to leave us with, and then that's all that I've got, is this. So God created man. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and every other living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit and seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he made, all that he had made, and it was very good. And it was very good. That's it.